So, WatchPitch listeners and viewers on the YouTube channel for WatchPitch, we're so glad you are here in the thick of our series on exits. And I'm here today with Mr. Chris Buehler, who is an advisor right now in our entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Western North Carolina, but also a seasoned exit expert. He's certainly been through the ringer, and we're going to find out more about that, and been very successful with that. And but with our earlier conversation, also is freely admitting that a few didn't make it off the launch pad. So I am so excited to have this conversation because a lot of our listeners are where you were, of course, and are actually, in many respects, trying to get to the point of an exit at some point. And they want to be able to talk about that intelligently, not only to their own people, but also to the investors who are investing in them. And having some experience in the mix from this conversation, I think, is going to be super valuable to everybody. So thanks for being here.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Trey.
Yeah, you bet. So you have had a few exits.
And one notable exit.
Exit.
I've seen a lot of different flavors of exits.
Oh gosh, I can't wait to hear about the flavors. So share a little bit about what works and what doesn't work when it comes to that point where you're thinking about an exit.
Okay. Well, the point, in my experience, to be thinking about an exit is longitudinally exactly the same point at which time an entrepreneur is going out to seek external funding from investors. Obviously, companies can have a very long pedigree and have a long history under a founder's tutelage, but it's at the point that an entrepreneur is looking for money, knowing that they will have to engage investors, that they need to start thinking about the exit. And that's important because typically an exit is the point in time where an investor will see a financial return on their investment. And so the challenge for an entrepreneur is to not necessarily dread, I've got to go raise money from investors and dread that process. It's put yourself in the shoes of the investor. When an entrepreneur is approaching that investor, the investor's going to be thinking about how much money is this going to take, how much time is it going to take to get to a point of exit or a return for that investor, and what does that look like? And if an entrepreneur isn't trying to put themselves in the shoes of an investor early in the asking process, it will not go as smoothly as it should. One of the key points that we were talking about earlier was just, at what time should an entrepreneur be thinking about an exit? And that basically is the point in time that that entrepreneur has it fixed in their minds that they need to attract outside investment.
So this is juicy because I am keenly aware of this quandary that many founders, CEOs, and the leadership team of any startup who is actually going out and pitching or having those conversations with potential investors. And this has happened to me personally, but this is not isolated, where talking about the exit is perhaps not the most PC thing to be talking about early on versus just getting out in front and saying, this is where we're headed, this is where we're going, and these are the watermarks that we're aiming for to get to that exit. And the reason being is having spoken to and pitched a few investors for WatchPitch, some of those investors were actually distracted by the fact that I was talking about the exit. And they were more keenly focused on my business plan and my business operations. And I think it's we're living in an interesting time with this world of startups and entrepreneurs where everybody's thinking about, not only that hustle, but the exit and the quick money and the fast money. And I'll come up with an idea and 2 years later, I'll be a multimillionaire. And I think people kind of get, okay, it may not happen like that, but it's certainly, those are the stories that the volume has turned way up on.
That's interesting to hear you describe it that way because, there's, like most things in life, there's got to be a balance struck.
Yeah.
If an entrepreneur is heavily skewed on the upfront investment and cost and process of getting their business up and running, but not looking at the tail end, which could include an exit. It looks off balance. Likewise, an entrepreneur who's focused solely on the exit and not on the fact that a lot of work has to go into getting to a point where an exit is even possible, again, in the eyes of an investor, I think will look equally unbalanced. And so it's that balance of, here's what this business is, here's what it's going to take to turn this business into a success story, and at some point in the future, how that success translates into a positive experience in terms of a return for an investor. So it's a bit of a balance in that sense where everything needs to be included, and to omit any one key critical component, including an exit, again, I think it was folly on the part of an entrepreneur not to at least have given it some thought about what they think that tail of their business looks like, because that will be part of what an investor will consider in making their investment decision.
So when you created the business that you had that I want to find out about, that you did actually exit on, were you aware of or pursuing an exit at that point? Or were you really just starting a business?
Yeah. My experience is probably an outlier. So
okay, that's all right. We're all outliers in the startup space.
Share that with you.
Okay.
The business where we did have a successful exit, my business partner and I had been working on this for about a year on our own dime, raising money. And it was a capital-intensive business. It required a lot of upfront investment in technology and engineering staff and supply chain management to get a new product to market. So we knew it was very capital-intensive. It was going to require a fair bit of capital up front. And it was a challenging environment at the time to go out and raise capital, 2008, when the world was shifting very
good timing,
monumentally through that period of time. When the investor that we did select to go forward with, and fortunately we did have a choice in terms of how we funded the business, but we decided to go with a strategic investor who was in an adjacent space, knew the general operating parameters that we were going to be engaging in, and had a lot of complementary services, back office services that they could offer as a part of their investment to really help us get to market faster, and allowed us to focus on the technology and the distribution and sales models that we needed to for this particular product. Part of the original terms of our agreement did include options for them to pick up additional equity from us as founders at certain trigger points, including buying out all of our equity in the business at certain key milestones. And those milestones were based on time and where we were in terms of growth and things like that. So
from the get-go, those were mapped out.
There were terms in our original term sheet under the investment that included ultimately the tool that they used to exit, or for us to exit and to sell them our remaining equity in the business.
So this was upfront from the beginning.
Very upfront, yes. Which is kind of, I think, when I say it's a bit of probably an outlier that it was baked in as a term in our original funding instrument. So we always knew that these things could, should, or maybe even would happen. So
is that so when you say outlier, so to me, I'm hearing another way to say that is this is an unusual circumstance with an investor for somebody to be so forward about that path of an exit.
Yes, but it was a very active strategic investor in industry. They had made several technology investments already, and so they had been down some paths, I think, prior to them investing in our company that led them to including terms of what an eventual exit might look like for them to acquire all the equity in the business.
What was that time frame?
Oh, gosh, I'm trying to think. I think our original term and our original milestone trigger point was something like 3 years, and then there was ultimately like a 5-year trigger point. And it was at the end of that period of time that they exercised their right to acquire all the remaining equity in the business.
I see.
Yeah. So it was not intentional on our part. Again, I mentioned that we had a choice of funding alternatives. All the right reasons why they were the best funding choice were present and ultimately came to bear fruit. And I have no regrets that we chose that course of action.
Yeah. And were they actively involved with the sort of board level management of the company? How did that?
Interestingly enough,
that was an interesting shift in your face.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they actually, part of our agreement with them gave them 3 of 5 board seats, but they were not an active board. But they were active in helping us execute on a day-to-day basis with a lot of the finance, accounting, supply chain management, a lot of the back office stuff to help us.
Actually,
so
that's huge help.
They were very intimately involved in our business at a functional and daily level. And I think that's one of the things that if I could step back in time and advise myself is, in a situation like that where ultimately our investor had control of the board is I think we could have done a much better job of elevating certain issues to a board level and getting the board bought into helping us solve some of those issues.
As opposed to just letting endure them?
Yes. Now, it was nice that they gave us, the confidence and the kind of the free reign, if you will, to execute on a lot of the elements of the business. As a founder, that's important.
Sure.
But again, having stepping out of my own shoes and projecting back in time, I would have advised myself to certainly ask the board at certain key steps along the business's life cycle where we needed help and what that help looked like.
So I would imagine with a pretty, what sounds like an aggressive schedule of headed toward that exit, knowing you were pretty much headed there almost from the beginning, that driver, in many respects, I would think would create a lot of security. I mean, really now you have to deliver. Well, I'm saying that only because there's actually an end in mind and it's been clearly defined. And this is not the case for a lot of startups and entrepreneurs or even business owners who have been in business for, maybe it's been a 10 to 20 year run with the whole family business. And now, one of the earlier podcasts we've had on this series, they talked about how they just got tired. They were 12, 15 years into it and pulling 16-hour days, 6 days a week at least, and they were done. And so then they started thinking about, all right, so what is our trajectory around an exit? And to me, then, what I think is super revelatory as we're exploring this whole pathway of an exit is that this is not something where you flip a switch and all of a sudden you've got a piece of paper and a handshake and a big check that can happen in a matter of months. This is years in the development. In your case, this was clear from the beginning. It still took 5 years. And of course, you had to sort of stay on track. And being given a lot of guidance, I would imagine, along the way to at least hit those benchmarks. I'm not saying they did the work for you because you still had to deliver, but nevertheless, you had a pathway. And I think this is what is fascinating and I think important for entrepreneurs and listeners of WatchPitch to begin to build into their own thought processes is, whether you are thinking about the exit or not right now, it's something you should be thinking about, and certainly your investors are if you've got that outside capital coming in. And so what are the things that you do? And so this is my next question is, knowing you had this pathway over 5 years, what were some of the things that really helped you to maintain the momentum to go in that direction? Now, of course, you were doing the right thing. You had the right product, and you probably were in the marketplace at the right time with the right product. So we can assume those are all going well. But what are some best practices that were in place that were your driver, that were your engine to sort of stay on course? And what were the things that helped you stay on course?
Well, the things that ultimately helped us stay on course was a strict adherence to looking at numbers and sales. And that's you're growing a business. Whether you're intending to exit or not, you still have to stay focused on your numbers. And that's ultimately very critical. We also had a unique marketplace where good PR was extremely important. It was a life-saving business. And at the point we exited, I think we had about 150 successful recoveries of missing people. So that was the hard thing to quantify. Is we expected PR to having more positive impact on our sales numbers.
And what was the business? Can you share?
Sure. It was a locating solution for what police call critical missings. These are typically seniors with dementia or children with autism who have a high frequency of wandering and getting lost and confused and going missing. And it was a pretty amazing business. We started as
every
a technology.
success story is a freaking news item.
Yes. And many of them were, and some of them were not for actually, kind of concerning reasons.
Personal privacy.
Yes.
Sure.
And we had to be HIPAA compliant as well because we were considered a adjacent medical space. We held a lot of information about individuals' medical records in case they did go missing. We could inform police what the underlying medical issue was with this person that they're looking for. So when we focused our business attention, it was always on the technology, the product, getting to the market. What we didn't realize, and this is kind of in line with what I was saying, is positive PR driving sales numbers. Is we learned a lot more about the life of a caregiver and how law enforcement does its work than we ever expected to. We thought, this is a technology company. We're saving lives, good for us. And in reality,
by the way, there's people in this thing.
We established very deep personal relationships with a lot of our caregiver customers and a lot of law enforcement agencies around the country. Anyways,
cool.
One of the things that I would say, though, that, again, in hindsight, for an entrepreneur such as ourselves in that circumstance, if there is an exit considered at some point in the future, an entrepreneur does need to inform themselves on how evaluation is made, because ultimately an exit is based on evaluation, and if you don't know what the math looks like of how evaluation is determined, an exit may or may not look particularly attractive. So entrepreneurs, this is one of those arcane arts in high finance, is how a business valuation is done, especially for early stage companies. Entrepreneurs are well advised to at least inform themselves a little bit about how traditional valuations are done and how valuations are done on earlier stage companies. It'll not only help them raise money from investors if they're choosing to go that course, it'll also help them to understand the dynamics that will drive what an exit looks like if they are on a path to make an exit.
What are the building blocks for a successful valuation?
Well, most of the building blocks for valuations are done on financial returns. What are your earnings?
Margins?
Yeah, what are your margins? What are your earnings? What are your adjacent comparable businesses, and how are they valued? Quite often in earlier stage companies that are, let's say, cutting edge, there's some sort of a new solution, new technique, new product, new service that they're introducing, there may not be good comparables. And that's when things get really murky.
Right.
But an entrepreneur at least understands from an investor's perspective how valuation is done, will much better position themselves to have a meaningful conversation with prospective investors. And investors may not always be looking for, I need to know exactly at what time, under what terms an exit's going to happen. I think most investors just want to know, does this entrepreneur have in their mind that I would like to have a return on my investment? And I think that's, going back to my earlier comment, why it's important for an entrepreneur to at least put themselves in the shoes of an investor and understand that investors is not just giving money out of the kindness of their heart, that they are expecting a return at some point, and under what form might that return be brought to them. And typically that's your traditional exits, acquisition, IPO, things of that nature.
Sure. So what are the things that can really hurt an exit strategy?
Oh, well, having a business that's not making any money and is not in a very favorable market is probably a
so the
surefire
financials.
way.
I mean, those, all that red ink.
Yes,
not good.
It is not uncommon to see businesses that are operating at a loss have a successful exit, but again, they have to have something special about what they're doing. They're creating a new market. They are,
proprietary
bringing
technology.
bringing
Yeah.
something of tremendous value to a potential acquirer that acquirer places a high value on. And in those circumstances, it is possible to kind of step out of the numbers, if you will, from an exit and evaluation perspective. But those are what we call the unicorns. Those are the rare things where the business fundamentally is not generating economic value of some nature, and then you have to rely on the value of intellectual property, the value of good PR, let's say. There are these intangible financial measures by which a potential acquirer would look at and value a business.
So, looking at perhaps some of these other businesses that you've had that didn't make it off the launch pad, do you think that had anything to do with the absence of an exit strategy? Or was it really just a matter of the marketplace or your team? Or I'm sort of curious if there's anything in this context of exit strategies.
The ones that I saw that were really horrifying, typically there was too much attention being paid on an exit and not enough attention being placed on operating the business and making it successful.
Huge. Right?
I can just share a story.
Please.
This was after I had departed the business, but some of my former partners were so convinced that this was going to be a huge success that they were selecting what their next fun sports car was going to be.
They were not.
They were.
They were shopping?
They were shopping with money that they were expecting from an exit that never came to fruition because the attention was not being placed on the needs of the business where it was at that point in time. So that's again an outlier. It's crazy,
distraction,
crazy outlier. But things like that do happen in entrepreneurs. It's that delicate balance that we have to strike in our day. Is yes, you do need to be paying attention to the future, but you also need to be paying close attention to the here and now, because the choices you're making in the here and now will ultimately drive the direction and value of a business in the future. And my first experience as an entrepreneur, I was not a founder in this company, but I was brought onto the management team fairly early on, and the company had raised a substantial amount of money in the go-go days of the dot-com boom, and had great prospects, had some very attractive funding alternatives placed in front of us, and we just could never see the controlling interests of the company just could not see their way to something that fundamentally required them to shift what they thought the ultimate value or exit of the business might look like. And so again, too much focus on what does that shiny object in the future look like, and not enough focus on this is a business that has to run. We have to have customers, we have to have revenue, we have to have earnings, and we have to be able to measure all those things in a meaningful way to create that value that ultimately will deliver a successful exit.
So if you were to advise, and I know you do this regularly, in terms of advising a founder or leadership team in a company, knowing that they're in the thick of actually getting those financials to look great, so they're focusing on the business, and that's what they're doing. They're 16, 18 hours a day. But as an advisor, you've got this perspective now on understanding that, okay, so this lifestyle is not sustainable, and you and your team may want to start thinking about those days in the future when you're not doing 16, 18-hour days, 6 days a week on your business. How would that start? What are some things that you could do or that you would advise that leadership team could start exploring as a different outcome than just working their ass off?
Well, that was a big, weighty question on the psychology of entrepreneurship.
Well, but you are the reason I'm asking this is that I have to believe that during your windshield time, as you're headed to sit down with a founder or a leadership team in a company as an advisor, after you get to know them a little bit and you kind of understand where their friction points are, and you've kind of added to the equation of creating less friction in that space, you have a perspective that many people don't, which is that you've had a exit. You know what that looks like. And it may be that, and I know running my own business, I'm focused on the business. I'm not thinking about an exit. In fact, I can't even frame what an exit would look like other than, oh, you mean I can give this business to somebody else and they're going to give me a check? That it's that simple.
Yeah.
And I know it's not.
Yeah. Again, kind of referring back to what I said at the beginning of our conversation, that when we talk about the topic of exits, it's coming from my experience, it's in the vein of an investor, a founder getting a business up and running to a point where there is an exit, and that exit is tied to the fact that they have raised outside money and they need to be able to offer a return to their investors. The family-owned business that's been around for 15 or 20 years, and a founder's tired and they're looking to sell the business or something like that. I have no meaningful insider perspective from that purview. But when it comes to founder and entrepreneur working their butts off on and in their business daily, if they know that they are going to need outside investment to either launch their business to a point of revenue, or to take that business with some revenue and scale it to a much bigger point, and they're starting to think about outside investment, it's so critical. It just always seems to come back to the numbers, is to be able to say, when you take somebody's money, an investor's money, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to spend it? Are you going to bring on additional staff so that you can have a manageable lifestyle and balance and quality of life, and rely on team members with different perspectives and different strengths to help scale this business and get it to where it needs to be? That's generally good news for an investor. An investor does not want to put money into a business where a founder is working those kind of crazy hours in perpetuity. Right. That's a recipe for disaster.
And even they know that.
And savvy investors will understand that.
Yeah.
And I think if I were to offer an entrepreneur a piece of advice, it's okay to share that with a potential investor. Say, I've been working 16 hours a day on this business, 6 days a week for the last year, whatever, and we've gotten it to this point. But I know that I cannot grow my business anymore because using this existing model of how I'm working, I need to bring on additional team members. I need outside money to help me bring on that additional staff that's going to ultimately make this business far more successful than I as a founder can do on my own. And that is a very professional, very mature, very insightful conversation to have with a prospective investor. And again, I think any savvy investor, sophisticated investor, will appreciate a founder being able to have that conversation with them as they're considering their investment.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Great.
Yeah.
I'm also heartened by the fact that there is no magic bullet for any kind of exit strategy that can possibly ignore the reality of those financials. I mean, you've just got to keep those records. You've got to track that. You've got to have that be a barometer of what eventually is going to bring value to any conversation around an exit. And they've got to be there.
Yeah. It's a business. It's got a lot of complicated moving parts, regardless of how many people are in that business. And when it comes down to it, financials are just a measure, a yardstick of the health of that business. And again, that's typically the starting point for any valuation tied to an exit. Yeah.
Nice. Well, Chris, I'm so glad we had this conversation. Thank you for getting us started and keeping us in this space of exploring the world of exits on the WatchPitch Podcast and Livecast, and looking forward to continuing to explore this topic.
Yeah.
And looking forward, of course, to seeing you in our ecosystem in all the circles you're in.
It's an enjoyable place to be. It's an enjoyable place to live, and I certainly appreciate you asking me to join you and have this conversation today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
All right, my pleasure. You're welcome.
Happy holidays.
Same to you, Trey.
All right.
Thanks.
Cheers.